Caroline, I'm coming to you next because this is something that, and again, I don't know, it's just timing and the universe listening to me, but one of my colleagues, Kelsey, had put a post out, I think it was last week on LinkedIn, and it was actually around COVID and people coming out of COVID and having gaps in their CVs where they've had to, through no fault of their own, come out of work. And this kind of linked in with several questions that I received about this panel. And it was around the fact about, from an applicant perspective, they're going through TA processes that will either involve, as we've just spoken about, applicant tracking systems, they have to upload CVs. How can organisations who ensure that their applicant tracking systems and screening processes are inclusive of candidates who might have had non-traditional career paths or gaps in their CVs? And the key question that was coming through to me was, do hiring managers want to see every single gap listed on that application form or process, and do they want to know why there was a gap and why they only did a short-term contract? Does that make a difference? What's going back to what Ewan said, how do you set them up for success? Because it's a real worry in terms of the applicant pool at the moment.
Yeah, and I hear that, and I think this is one of the areas where TA can really add value. I think that we've got a real responsibility to do better, much to Ewan's point a second ago about interviews, and have people spend hours and hours on a CV and list every gap just isn't realistic or reasonable. And I think that human touch, that human value add is really important here. And working with our hiring community in that strategic trusted partner space is where we need to get to. I think it can be tempting to forget how busy our hiring managers are, and maybe, when you're working with them, I think they've got time issues, busy manager space. So how can we really guide and kind of enable them to have a thoughtful approach when they're screening CVs? So absolutely no, I don't expect candidates to list every gap. We want them to tell a story and have a space and a platform to tell their story, but really working with the hiring community to identify those skills that they're really looking for, that skills-based hiring, having a debate and a dialogue about gaps and how actually diversity of experience is really important. Linking back to our squiggly careers approach at AG Bar, where we're encouraging folk to do different things and try different things, and playing that back in terms of what's the reality out in the candidate pool and what we're facing at the moment works for us. So I do think we've got a part to play in moving that along and thinking of other ways that we can help candidates tell that story.
Great. No, because I think there was a lot of people asking me, should we only really put the career experience that is relevant to the job that we're applying for? But then their worry is, but then I've got like a 6-month gap. And so what you've just said, I hope I love that squiggly career map. It is that they're talking. That's what they're talking about. Does the life experience that I've had and the reasons for that
absolutely
contribute to my application? Okay. Any other points anybody wants to add to that or to what Caroline's already said?
I would love to flip that on its head in terms of, we're talking about gaps. But what you're also finding with the neurodivergent community is there's a lot of job hopping, and that instantly switches organizations off. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing for ND candidates is encouraging them that if they do feel as though there's a history book of many, many different positions, and for whatever reason it hasn't worked out, you don't need to have a black book of your positions and your roles. Break it down, put it into a skills matrix, put it in why it would apply to this position. There's various reasons, especially if you don't realize that you're neurodivergent, why positions haven't worked for you and you've moved on. And I think that it's getting that balance between knowing you've got the skills and you've applied them and you've been in very many different sectors, and applying that to the position that you are ultimately applying for, to your strengths.
It's interesting, Tasha, you saying that, because I'm not disagreeing with you. However, I am definitely hearing more of an appetite from hiring managers who I think are better educated now, because my argument for people that have had a lot of careers is actually the life experience. They can come in, doesn't faze them. They don't get involved in all the office politics. There's a huge amount of benefits sometimes to individuals that have done a number of contracts. And you do get people that just, that's what they love doing. They are professional contractors. And I totally agree in that, goodness me, not that I will obviously name and shame publicly, but we have worked with a number of customers who have said, oh, Katie, they've moved about far too many times. We want a loyal person with at least 2 to 3 years between each job. I'm hearing less of that now. I will be very upfront. However, it still exists. So let's not deny that. But it's interesting because I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, Tasha. There are reasons. And as you say, a lot of people who are neurodivergent or neurodiverse don't realise that they are. So they don't know why that job didn't work out. So it's a really valid point. And goodness me, you could ask a lot about this area, but I like that. Okay. Right, Gordon, you're not escaping. I'm coming to you now. I hope your mum's got this on record. Right, let's go back to video interviews, right? It was something I spoke about right at the start. Now, you tell me, I'm not sure whether Ernst & Young do use video tech. I think when we first actually spoke, I had seen a couple of posts about, oh, we use video tech for our shortlisting. It's really innovative. My thoughts, it's not innovative. However, I know it's got its place and there are a lot of companies that use it. So I'm coming to you to ask you, from your experience, how do video interviews compare to the more traditional, I guess, in-person, face-to-face interviews when it comes to actually assessing candidate qualifications as well as fit? And let's be honest, that kind of cultural fit is as important, if not more sometimes, than the actual technical skills. But what kind of lessons have you learned from experiencing using both? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts to it, right? A lot of companies now are using more video submissions, which is a separate conversation we come on to, but the video interviews themselves, the positives of video interviews are they're convenient, right? The downside, the negative of video interviews are they're convenient, right? That's the same thing. If you're looking at the COVID situation and people not coming in, that's where video interviews really came to the fore. And a lot of companies stuck with that because of the convenience of, having to just dial a candidate in, and you can sometimes move quicker with that as well, right? People don't need the same time off work, call in the old dentist appointment and all those tricks, right? They can just dial in from that. The flip side of that, though, is you don't really get that feel. From a candidate perspective as well, right? That's important. I mean, in advance of this session, I was reflecting on my experience at EY when I joined. I remember going into the reception and being really nervous and speaking to the receptionist who said, have you got an interview? And we chatted for a few minutes and she said to me, well, look, you look the part and you seem quite pleasant. So as long as you know your stuff, you'll be okay. And I thought to myself, I kind of do know my stuff without being arrogant, right? This is the area I've been working in for a long time. And it put me at ease, but also gave me a really good first impression of the company. That was my experience getting in and meeting the receptionist, seeing the building, seeing the interviewers. So I went in, in a different frame of mind, and possibly if I'd just finished a work meeting and that finished at 1 minute to 1 and dialed into an interview at 1 o'clock, right, when you're in a totally different mindset. People are also very different on camera, myself included. I can be quite animated in person when I'm speaking, but on camera, I've had feedback I can be quite still, just based on your sitting posture and all these different things. So you're not really necessarily getting a real gauge of who the candidate is. You don't have that opportunity for the small talk in between, which sometimes can be really important, right, before and after the session. It's really clinical. So I think what we're seeing more of, certainly at EY, is that we're definitely, where possible, switching back to face-to-face. And I caveat that slightly. We do a lot of overseas recruitment where video interviewing, getting back to that point, is really convenient because you're not going to fly everyone into the UK, which sometimes we had to do in the past. So it's really convenient to do video interviews with those that are not in country, and you can still assess their capabilities in that way. But where people are local and can, we have now gone back to that preferential option of face-to-face, just because you can build that connection relationship. Like I say, importantly for the candidate as well as the company, it's a two-way street ultimately. So yeah, we're finding that the benefits of face-to-face interviewing outweigh the sort of convenience of the video approach.
Carolyn, I mean, what's your take on it?
So agree with all of that. We've got a bit of a blended approach, as I suppose most people have at AG Bar. My own experience, I had a recorded interview, a face-to-face video interview, and then an in-person interview. So there was a 3-stage progress, and that opens up another question, doesn't it, about length of process? However, it did give them a really rounded view. So I think a blended approach, depending on location, grade, seniority, all of that stuff is where we're at the moment.
Okay. And I'm going to open this up just because I know it's such a key question, but Ewan, what are your sort of approaches at Aegon around this area?
Yeah, it was interesting when Gordon mentioned it about getting into reception. It took me back to when I worked at the Commonwealth Games, and we had hundreds and thousands of candidates coming in, volunteers, you name it. And a colleague at the time who worked on reception said a statement with me, and I use this example a lot, and it's stuck with me for all these years. And she said, "I'm not the receptionist, I'm the director of first impressions for this organisation,"
I
and I
love
love
that.
it.
That's so
I
good.
absolutely love it. So 1 minute, for example, we would have a candidate coming into Gordon's point, really nervous, I'm coming for an interview. And then we would have someone from the Commonwealth Games Federation, or we had Anthony Joshua, and she would treat them all the same. And I love that, and it sticks with me.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, that's
Gordon's
good.
point, it
That
took
is
me back.
good.
It was quite nice. Gordon also made a really interesting point about COVID. And you really seen a sharp rise in video, the use of video, I guess, like this as a
Yeah.
two-way, but you also saw a really sharp rise in using it as this sort of screening tool. So record as one-way video. And I guess I look at that, reframe my thinking on that, and think at the time where human beings needed the most connection ever, we were forced to stay at home and not connect.
Mm.
He is potentially talent acquisition, wider talent. We drove that even further to less humanization and more
that's right,
disconnection. So I think what we've discussed, and it's clear that there is a place for some of this at certain times if used in the right way. But I would love to see, and Gordon touched on there, Carolyn, as well, of coming back out of the pandemic. Well, certain things worked pretty well before then. Let's progress our thinking. So I guess at Aegon we have a pretty blended model, similar to Carolyn. If there's times where seniority, different levels, absolutely. Where we can, try and bring people into the office, because our office is great, and you're going to be there. So we're 40%. We're 2 days a week in the office.
Okay.
And it's really important for that employer brand as well. Sorry to speak over you.
No, not at all. And I agree with your point. So let Carolyn go.
For them to get a real sense of what the workplace is like, what it feels like to work here. I remember at AG Bar I got a factory tour and I was so giddy. It was so exciting, but it really did kind of solidify the reality of working in a manufacturing and fast-moving consumer goods company. So I think that buy-in and that unique selling point is quite important for a visit as well.
Totally agree.
I think also just a final point. Sorry, Katie, just a final point on that. I think. Yeah, just I think we also have to remember that when candidates are interviewing, it's unlikely they're interviewing in one place, right? So the small wins are really important. So if you've got a candidate, just to Carolyn's point, that can come in and see the building and see the environment and meet the people, versus someone who's just had a video interview. I don't mean to say just it to demean it, but it's a big decision to change jobs, right, and move into a new place. So if you've got 3 options and one you've gone in and met the people and you love it, and the others you haven't had that, you might think the company's fine, the job's fine, but you've had the feeling, right? You've seen it, you know what you're getting into. So that competition element and those small margins are really important as well when you're trying to compete for the best talent in the market.
Yeah. Absolutely. Tasha, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think in terms of bringing us back to COVID, it opened the ability for talent acquisition on a wider scope. So I do a lot of predominantly independent financial advisor firms recruitment. And the kind of, to bring that back, inclusivity, the traditional 9 to 5 everyday commute, it can very increasingly result in burnout. And we're finding that the remote aspect of being able to do video interviews and having that entry, it's given a wider scope to the neurodivergent community. I mean, 20%, they estimate 20% of society is neurodivergent. So if you're closing off with only having face-to-face interviews, you're closing yourself off to 20% of society, but it also means that you're tapping into a wider, direction of talent, that you may live in Scotland, but the employer's in London. But that doesn't mean that, you don't stand a chance, which I think is very positive. But then there is that aspect of human interaction, being able to go and touch and feel and see where you're going and get that feel for the vibe and the culture. Again, very, very strong argument for the positives and negatives on both sides.
Yeah. And I think, the key thing I'm hearing from all of you there is that whole kind of blended approach, and there's a balance and making sure it's fit for purpose, etc.